I welcome all the participants of this afternoon's session. It's the last afternoon session of the training school, and it is my great pleasure that we could have Professor Winfield talking about two of his passions, and that's AI ethics and academic blogging as part of the transferable skills training that we tend to offer to our ESRs, and since it's open to the audience, also to our participants from outside TranSYS. Alan, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. That's great. So yes, I'm speaking on two things: academic blogging and AI ethics, in that order. But the academic blogging, is not going to fill up more than probably 5 or 10 minutes. So most of the talk will be on robot and AI ethics. And I really have to speak about robotics from the perspective of robotics, because that's what I do. I'm a roboticist, a professional electronic engineer. I've run a business. I was co-founder of the Bristol Robotics Lab nearly 30 years ago, which is quite a long time, and you can see some pictures of the lab here. And my research really is in two areas: cognitive robotics and robot ethics, and that includes machine ethics. This is just to give you a picture of what I'm up to. I'm semi-retired now. I work at UWE just 2 days a week, but I'm also a visiting professor at York and a fellow at Cambridge. I've been involved for some years now in standards development, both for the British Standards Institute and the IEEE, and I'm going to mention a bit about that work during part 2 of the talk. And I'm also a member of the Global AI Council of the WEF. So I get to meet some interesting people in these various voluntary duties. So let me talk about academic blogging. And I've been running a blog, I think, for some time. Let me think. I think it was 2006. So what, 15, 16 years now that I've had a blog. And of course, I don't need to tell you this. I'm sure you're well aware. It's essentially a collection of mini essays, blog posts, written and self-published by an academic, and I'm certainly an academic. And the key thing is self-published. And the kind of weird thing about a blog, which is very liberating, is that you write your piece and then you literally publish it, and that's it. The world can read it from the moment that you press the publish button. And of course, we're very unused to that as academics. We're used to submitting our papers for review and waiting months, sometimes years, before they actually appear, available to read. So the immediacy of blogging is very attractive. That was the thing that I really liked about it to start with. And it was only a few years after I'd started my blog that I realized that it is actually a valuable part of scholarship. And here is a quote from the very good London School of Economics Social Sciences blog. So, Rohan Mateson says it's a valuable supplement to scholarship and challenges the status quo. Well, it does in a way that you're writing about your work, as it were, outside the narrow confines of academic publications and conferences. So I regard blogging as part of science communication, and science communication is part of open science. And I think that's a very good thing. I think it's a strong principle of good practice. So, questions that you should ask yourself if you're interested in starting a blog are, well, how do I set it up? Well, it's very easy. There are typically two big platforms that most bloggers use. One is a Blogspot, the Google platform, which I use. The other one is WordPress. Doesn't cost any money. It's very simple to set up, and you know, a short learning curve to get the idea of how to use it. You need to decide what to write about, and I'll give you some ideas in a second. It's very important not to be too hard on yourself. So, you know, some bloggers, academic bloggers, determine that they're going to write a blog post a week. Well, that's crazy, because we all have very difficult weeks with lots of teaching and reviewing and other things. So it's best not to set a very hard deadline on yourself or schedule, because really you should blog when you feel like it, not because you feel you have to. You know, a blog is not work. You know, it should be something that you enjoy doing, and you do when you feel like it. You also need to decide whether to blog as yourself or as a representative of your university. And of course, some universities do actually offer blogging platforms for their staff, and that's a third option. And that's, you know, that's a good option as well. It didn't exist when I started my blog, so I'm a sort of semi-representative of my university in the sense that I'm offering my own points of view, but I'm, you know, I don't blog anything that I think the university would be unhappy with. I mean, it's not that I self-censor, it's just that you know, I am blogging as me, but me, you know, I'm clearly representing my university in some sense as well. And of course, that comes on to the question of controversial issues. Do you blog about controversial issues? Well, that's your choice. You know, it really depends on how bold you feel. I mean, I tend not to blog on controversial issues, but I certainly have blogged on things like you know, I've shared my views on why robots should not be gendered, for instance. So I've kind of impinged on you know, elements of feminism, and I certainly regard myself as a pro-feminist. So you know, you know, I think it's important to blog about what you care about, and sometimes those things might be controversial. Where does your blog fit within your academic work? Well, I think we can integrate a blog with our mainstream dissemination, and therefore, you know, the positive impact is we increase the reach and impact of our work. So, you know, there are three things. I mean, there are more than three things that I use my blog for, but these are the main three things. So I blog posts with updates on current projects. So that's really part of an open science approach. In other words, I'm telling, you know, people about my projects, and of course I'll tag each post with the name of the project, which means that you can then send people a link to all of the blog posts collected together on that particular project. And that's especially helpful if you're contacted by journalists, for instance, which I often am. And it means that you don't have to, you can say, well, go and read my blog, and then you'll understand a bit about the you know, the project. And I also do say to journalists that I'm happy for them to quote from my blog. I also tend to write blog posts when I've published a new academic paper. In other words, it'll be a kind of a simple to read, easy to read summary of the paper with some of the key results. So again, that's part of a public engagement science communication approach. And then when I give talks, then I will blog a post with a summary of the talk with the slides embedded, which is very nice, a very nice feature that you can do. And that means that I've got a lot of my talks therefore appear in blog posts. And some years after I started my blog, I think 2011, so that's about 10 years ago, I did join Twitter. And I found actually that I post tweets about a new blog post, and it really increases the reach of my blog way beyond where it used to be, you know, pre-Twitter. So Twitter actually helps me to spread the word that I've, you know, that I have blog posts and so on. And you may well, and many academics have YouTube videos. So you know, I mean, I'm not especially active on YouTube, but I do. Some of my talks do have YouTube videos, and those are in fact summarized on a separate page as part of my blog as well. So your blog in a sense brings things together, which I think is quite nice. So that's really just wanted to conclude there. And here are some blogs that I particularly recommend as examples. I didn't want to give all robotics blogs. So Joanna Bryson is a friend of mine. She writes a very nice blog on AI and well, all sorts of issues. She's at the Hertie School in Berlin. The LSI blog I mentioned already, Social Sciences. PZ Myers has a very famous blog. He's essentially a very politically engaged biologist in the US, and it's worth checking out. And then another friend of mine, Elizabeth Leach at Oxford, has a very nice blog on her work on musicology. So there's a very broad spread indeed, covering the arts and sciences and social sciences. So I'll leave that with you, and I'll pause just to give myself a drop of water before I launch into part 2 of the talk, and I'll show you how this is structured. So I'm going to introduce robot ethics, but of course everything I say about robot ethics applies to AI. So, you know, ethics of robots, robot ethics are generalizable to AI. So although I'm going to be talking about robotics because that's my field, I'm going to nevertheless, you know, make it clear that what I'm talking about is applies equally to AI ethics. So I'll introduce responsible innovation and responsible robotics. I'll talk about why robot and AI ethics are so important today and give some examples of the kind of harms that are happening, you know, not just that might happen, but are happening already, and finish with a short summary of my work on ethical governance and standards. So again, I'm a roboticist, so I'm going to start by telling you what an intelligent robot is. And I define it with reference to AI. In fact, very simply, I define a robot as an embodied artificial intelligence, an AI inside a physical body. And typically, a robot will sense its environment. You can see the yellow arrow on the top, and the AI will essentially determine the robot's next possible action. And that action will then be performed, and you know, the action is manifest in the real world, and of course that sense act loop is exactly true for all animals, including ourselves. So we do exactly the same thing. We sense the world, and our natural intelligence, not artificial intelligence, decides what we're going to do next in the world. In this case, I'm, you know, talking here, pontificating, waving my arms and deciding what to say next. So those are all actions that have been selected by my inbuilt, as it were, evolved human intelligence. So robots, we often talk about autonomous systems in robotics, and I'll just tell you what that means. It means that a robot chooses its next possible action without human intervention. Having told you that, there are very few robots that actually do that. And autonomy lies on a scale you can see from none at all to full autonomy. Full autonomy is very rare because we almost never have robots that are not subject to human supervision, monitoring, and control. And sometimes this spectrum is called supervised autonomy. And surprisingly, one of the most autonomous robots that is in the world is perhaps the most simplest, which is a robot vacuum cleaner. It's not fully autonomous because you still have to provide it with a charging station and an energy supply, and of course you have to manually empty its dust bin whenever it gets full. So it's not completely autonomous, but then neither are you or I. I mean, our autonomy is limited by physical constraints and also by protocols, habits, and laws as well. So, you know, no human being, although we regard ourselves as autonomous beings, our autonomy in truth is limited, and it has to be in order for us to live in societies. You know, if you want to be truly autonomous, then as a human being, you've got to go off into the wilderness, and then you can pretty much do what you want. I suspect, but you're still constrained, of course, by your physical body. It's helpful to talk about the first wave of real-world robots, which of course predated AI for many, by many years. So robots like these on the left, robot arms, have been around for 40 or 50 years in assembly plants, production lines. This is a car assembly plant. Also, robots in warehouses have been around a long time. And this one in the bottom middle is a remotely operated underwater vehicle. So that's a teleoperated robot. And then we have this one on top right, which is a bomb disposal robot. Again, it's teleoperated by humans, by soldiers. And the one on the bottom right is a first wave robot. Even though it's very advanced and very expensive, it's a Mars rover, because these robots are mostly teleoperated. They have little bits of autonomy, but very little, because they're too expensive and the risk is too high to let them do what they do, without human intervention. But the second wave, there is a second wave of robots, which are now in the world and represent a really big change from the first wave. So, and the change is characterized by, firstly and most importantly, this second wave are robots designed to interact with humans. So none of the robots on the previous slide interact directly with humans, because they're working in dangerous places. They are dangerous in the case of the industrial robots. You don't want to get close to them because you will get hurt. Second wave robots turn that on its head, and we have robots that are designed to interact with humans. Second wave also includes multi-robot systems or teams of robots, bio-inspired robots, robots that are inspired directly by whole animals or parts of animals. In this case, a rat. This is a model of a rat with whiskers. It doesn't look like a rat, but it has actually a brain, which is an artificial neural network, which is directly modeled on a little tiny piece of the rat's brain. So it's a kind of model, scientific model of both the whiskers and the brain. And this is a working flying dragonfly robot, which is remarkable, by a German company called Festo, which make extraordinarily interesting biomimetic robots. And then we have learning, which, I mean, again, few robots learn, but nevertheless, that's part of the second wave. And finally, we have a new generation of smart materials, soft materials, In fact, there's a picture of an artificial whisker that we developed in our lab. So really all of these things come into this second wave, but the main thing is that second wave robots are social robots. They're designed to work with humans up close in our offices, homes, workspaces, public spaces, and so on. That's a big change from the first wave. And of course, that really impacts enormously on ethics. So how do we define intelligence? We're talking now about both robot intelligence and artificial intelligence. And this paper surveyed 70-odd definitions and kind of boiled them down to intelligence measures an agent's ability to achieve goals in a wide range of environments. Personally, I prefer the kind of folk definition at the bottom, doing the right thing at the right time. You have to be smart to do that, because what the right thing is, you know, may well be tricky to figure out. And I mentioned action selection already. So like an animal, a robot must choose its next possible action. And smarter robots typically are smarter because they have a bigger pool of better actions and more sophisticated strategies for deciding which one is appropriate at a particular time. In other words, to figure out what to do next. And of course, you and I have to do that as well. Learning, of course, is a method for both discovering new actions and/or better strategies for action selection. And often the learning in most systems, learning systems, focuses on discovering new actions, whereas actually the second of those is, if anything, more important, can be more important, is better being able to choose between your existing pool of possible actions. Now, this is what I regard as the relationship between AI and robotics. There's an overlap, and the overlap between robots and AIs are intelligent robots, exactly the ones we're talking about now. I'm not considering the larger number of non-intelligent robots, those that don't have an AI, but essentially go through a preset sequence of actions like a washing machine. Those are not intelligent. And I've drawn a bigger circle for AI because today there is more AI in the world than there are robotics, than there are robots. So I regard intelligent robots really as a subset of AI. And of course, my roboticist colleagues get very cross with me about that, but I think it's a fact. You know, we have to accept that intelligent robots are one facet of the larger field of AI, which of course, as you know, is very much the thing at the moment. So ethics, what do we mean by ethics? Well, a dictionary definition, I think this is probably from the Oxford English Dictionary, is ethics can be viewed as moral principles which govern a person's behavior or the behavior of a behavior of a group. And there are many, of course, ethics have been debated by philosophers for thousands of years and still are. And a principle that is very ancient is this one. It's called the Golden Rule. Treat others how you wish to be treated, which is a very, it's a very fundamental principle, which we hope our fellow humans and countrymen, countrywomen do actually abide by that. Of course, not all of them do, sadly, but that's a very good ethical principle. But robot ethics are concerned, of course, with the ethical impact of robots on individuals, society, and the environment, and how we can mitigate, in other words, reduce the potential negative impacts. We're happy with positive impacts, of course, but robot ethics is primarily concerned with negative impacts of robots in society. This is a word cloud of AI ethics keywords, and you can see the kinds of ethical concerns and principles that are typically covered. AIs should be unbiased. That's a really big issue in AIs, of course. Non-gendered, in my view. They should be accountable. They should be transparent. I'm going to talk about transparency, this thing on the left. They should respect diversity and human rights, be explainable, be sustainable. That's increasingly important, of course, given the climate emergency. And in practical terms, robot ethics is really concerned with how human designers, manufacturers, operators, and maintainers should behave in order to both identify and address those negative ethical impacts. So what do robot and AI ethicists do? Because, fundamentally what we do is worry. We worry about the bad things that might happen, but of course worrying isn't enough. So the positive things that we do, well, we develop ethical principles to support and guide the way that robots are designed and deployed. We develop methods for building values, those values into our robots and our AIs. That's a simple way of thinking of that is ethically aligned design. It's sometimes also called values-driven design. So it's a kind of new way of a new perspective on the design process. And again, I'll refer to some work on that shortly. We draft new ethical standards in robotics and AI, and I've been very heavily involved in that for the last nearly 10 years. And I'll mention some of the standards that I have been and am currently involved in. And of course, we do advocacy. We do public engagement. We work with with anybody who will listen, especially policymakers, in order to increase the adoption and, well, initially awareness of the dangers, and ideally the introduction of regulation to address as it were the worst harms that may happen, and in many cases are happening already. So responsible robotics is something that I'm very concerned about, and responsible robotics really is a subset of responsible innovation. And I'm sure you're all aware that there are many frameworks of responsible innovation. The EU, in fact, I was involved in drafting the Rome Declaration on Responsible Innovation back, I think, in 2014. And typically, there are 6 pillars of responsible innovation, and you can see them on this word cloud on the right: open access, governance, ethics, science communication, public engagement, and gender equality. So responsible robotics and responsible AI, I define like this. So robotics I define as the application of responsible innovation in the design, manufacture, operation, repair, and end-of-life recycling, very important, that seeks the most benefit to society and the least harm to the environment. And let's rewrite that for AI. Well, it's again the same, the application of responsible innovation in the design, marketing, operation, and management of AI systems that seek the most benefit and the least harm to the environment. The least harm to the environment, of course, applies particularly strongly for AI systems because many of them are very energy intensive. So AI systems are not energy free by any means. I have done some work as part of a group advising the Scottish Government on its digital economy strategy, pointing out the energy costs of AI, which are not trivial. So why are robot ethics and AI ethics by extension so important? Well, because robots can harm us. And I'm going to give you some examples. And these examples really transfer to AI as well. Some of them, perhaps not all of them yet, but the first, of course, is that accidents happen, and this is the very sad picture of a crashed, fatally crashed Tesla back in May 2016. It's the first known failure of an AI autopilot in a car, and the owner of the car, the driver, sadly was not paying attention at the time in the 20 or 30 seconds leading up to the accident, and was killed very sadly. In fact, accidents, especially fatal accidents involving driverless cars, are very rare, happily, but they're big news events, so we get to hear about them. What we tend not to hear about are accidents involving social robots. This one we only know about where a security robot had a collision with a child. The child was hurt, not seriously, but it made the press in the US. So we do know about that particular accident. But in general, social robots, the accidents are hidden from view because they're not regarded as big news, or certainly not headline news in the way that that these driverless car fatalities are. But harm, physical harm, is not the only harm that can occur, and one particular harm that we worry about is dependency. In other words, you become dependent on, for instance, a surrogate pet. Now, this isn't necessarily a harm, and I should say that the Paro, it's a Japanese robot pet. It's a baby harp seal, and it's very cute. I've come across these in Japan. They're amazing pieces of technology, and have been used very successfully and proven to be so in helping elderly people either after trauma, such as following evacuation from certainly following the 2011 Fukushima nuclear accident, following a tsunami, of course, and these robots were shown to be very helpful in supporting elderly people who had to be evacuated, and of course they are used in elder care homes. But nevertheless, and I think those are good applications, but we need to care about dependency, because it's, it might be a bad thing if, for instance, an elderly or vulnerable person came to believe the robot cared for them. Of course, a robot cannot care for you in the way that your dog or your cat, well, questionably cat, I'm a dog person, but I'm pretty sure my dog cares for me sometimes, at least. So in a way that a robot cannot, of course. So dependency and over trusting is a related ethical harm in relation to social robots. Privacy is clearly a harm in AIs and robots, and these robot toys are interesting because they're typically connected devices. They rely on the internet and an internet connectivity for things like speech and facial recognition, and of course that raises questions on privacy. And in fact, it can go beyond privacy. A colleague of mine in the lab reported that one of these robots was being used by 5 or 6 children, and the robot, which had sophisticated facial recognition, correctly learned how to recognize all but one of the children's faces, and the child who the robot simply would not recognize their face, despite repeated attempts to train it, that child, of course, was very distressed, as you'd expect a 5 or 6 year old child to be distressed in that situation. So, you know, robot toys have harms that go beyond privacy, so you know, it's an interesting area. Jobs, of course, is a perennial concern, and concern about job losses, job displacement, about robots has been around since the first wave, and it's certainly true that assembly line robots have replaced assembly line workers, and indeed the same thing is happening in warehouses. These are some robots that are used in Amazon warehouses. In fact, Amazon wanted the robot so badly that they bought the company Kiva, so, but typically the history of jobs and robots in manufacturing and warehousing and so on is that the additional wealth created by automation generates more jobs, more net jobs than are lost. But of course, that doesn't help you very much if you're one of the workers who, you know, has lost their job, especially if you can't get another one. So, you know, arguably, first wave robots have well, the evidence suggests that they've generated more jobs than they've displaced. But of course, those jobs are different and require retraining. Now, is that the same with AI? Well, I'm not sure. I think there's an open question on that. Second wave robots, well, here are some examples of driverless vehicles. You can see this one, this Otto vehicle. Clearly, there isn't a driver there. And I think that truck drivers are probably at risk of being displaced within 10 or 15, 20 years, perhaps even sooner. But the interesting thing is that those drivers, they won't be replaced completely. I believe that they'll become a bit like airline pilots. In other words, they'll be required to drive the truck from the depot onto the freeway, onto the motorway, the autobahn, and then they'll engage the autopilot and, you know, go to sleep or drink coffee or whatever, read a book, until the autopilot tells the driver that they're about to reach the destination. So then the driver will take over and navigate the truck to the destination depot. Now, that in a sense is a parallel of what airline pilots mostly do these days. They're required, you know, to be manually taking the plane off and landing it. I mean, we do have automated landing systems, of course, but the autopilot typically is used, you know, during the, as it were, a level flight. And of course, the big difference will be that I think truck drivers sadly will not enjoy the same prestige and salaries as airline pilots do. Taxis, driverless taxis, I think are a long way ahead, simply because the technology, the autopilot technology, is not good enough yet to allow a taxi, for instance, to autonomously navigate a busy, crowded city street, you know, with pedestrians and cyclists and buses and police, you know, and ambulances running around, and all of the chaos that we know of a busy city centre is well beyond a driverless vehicle autopilot right now, and it's hard to see when that might, you know, change. So I you know, whenever I talk to taxi drivers, as one does, they ask me, is my job safe? And I say yes, and probably your son or daughter's job if they take over your business, at least for, you know, several decades, I believe. So we can see that really there are four categories of ethical harm. Unintended physical harm, unintended psychological harm, unintended socio-economic harm, and that includes harms to society itself from AIs, and there's plenty of evidence of those, and of course unintended environmental harm. So, as I say, we're concerned about how we can minimize or mitigate those harms. So I'm just going to pause for another sip of water. How are we doing for time?
Okay, if I had to unmute myself, yeah, we're okay. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to make sure there's time for questions.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe if we have 10 minutes for questions and then we have a break, so we have a little bit of a buffer. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so I with my long-term now research collaborator Marina Girotka, we published a paper in 2018 on ethical governance, and this is really trying to bridge the gap, if you like, between ethical principles, which are easy to write, and ethical practice, which is hard. So, you know, there are many ethical principles in the world, but very few people do good ethical governance. And this, we had this paper, as I say, 3-4 years ago. And in that paper, we made the link, and this diagram appears in the paper, between ethics, standards and regulation. So we argued that ethics underpin standards, and in turn, standards are necessary for regulation. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of these things, the things in red. In fact, I'm not going to mention the EPSRC principles, that there isn't time, but I will mention the other things in red here. So there has been a proliferation of AI principles, and this very nice paper that appeared in 2019 by in Nature Machine Intelligence lists the principles that appeared in 84, no less, ethical frameworks. And you can see which are the most frequent principles. Transparency is top of the list, followed by justice and fairness, non-maleficence, in other words, doing no harm, responsibility, privacy, and so on. So a really interesting survey, but all of those principles boil down to the same thing. And this is my kind of mashup of all of those 84 principles. Do no harm while being free of bias and deception, respect human rights and freedoms, including dignity and privacy, while promoting well-being, and be transparent and dependable while ensuring that responsibility and accountability remains with human designers or operators. The final one is very important because robots and AIs are not people. They're not responsible agents. And you know, I argue a lot with anybody who would claim otherwise. So I mentioned the IEEE, and back in 2016 they launched this initiative on global initiative on ethics of autonomous and intelligent systems. It's a terrific initiative with volunteers from all over the world. And after several years, we published this first edition of Ethically Aligned Design. So it's a kind of crowdsourced document that went through multiple iterations. If you haven't seen it, I recommend that you go and look at the website. There is the link, ethicsinaction.ieee.org, and you can download this for free. It's an open document. But of course, being a standards body, the IEEE have launched a set of standards following the recommendations of that document. There are probably about 150 recommendations in the document. And one of the standards I've been leading for the last 5 years, called P7001, on transparency of autonomous systems. And I was very pleased, therefore, you can imagine, when that Jobin paper came out, because I'd already been working on transparency. So to discover that it's the most popular principle was obviously very, very heartening. Hopefully means that we've not been wasting our time. And in fact, I have a paper which I can point you to in Nature Electronics, just summarizing all of these ethical standards and the thinking behind them in robotics and AI. I mentioned P7001, which is the standard I've been leading, but you can see a whole bunch of standards have spun out of that global ethics initiative of the IEEE. But before I tell you about P7001, I'm going to tell you about this standard, because this is the first explicitly ethical standard, I believe, in the world. And I was part of the working group that wrote this standard. It's called BS 8611, and it is actually a method for doing ethical risk assessment. Now, risk assessment, of course, is a very well-known thing. It's I'm an old-fashioned safety critical systems engineer, so we used to do risk assessment all the time. And of course, ethical risk assessment is what ethics research committees do. I mean, you'll all have one in your universities. So ethical risk assessment is not new, but the application or the articulation of a method for conducting ethical risk assessment on robots and AIs is new, and that's what this standard does. It's a method. And it basically sets out 20 distinct ethical hazards and risks under these 4 categories, and explains how to mitigate, or gives advice on how to mitigate those risks, and also on how those measures might be verified or validated. How can you prove that you've actually reduced that particular risk? And here are some definitions. An ethical harm is defined as anything that compromises psychological and or societal and environmental well-being. A hazard is just a source of ethical harm, and a risk is the ethical harm arising from exposure to the hazard. So those are some sort of standards are a bit like legal documents. They define everything very carefully. That's why it takes such a long time to write standards, typically 5 years. And here are some of the societal hazards from BS 8611. You can see down the left-hand side. I've blanked out that bit, but I'll just point to deception, and here's possible deception that you believe that you're interacting with a person, but in fact you're interacting with an AI. So that's a deception. And of course, some places in the world, and I believe that California, state of California, was going to make it illegal to fail to declare that the thing you're interacting with is not a human being. So in other words, you should not be deceived. You should know that you're interacting with a non-human agent. Anthropomorphization, of course, is a risk. We anthropomorphize anything. Of course, this is an excuse for my favorite movie robot, WALL-E. And addiction. Now, those of you old enough will remember the Tamagotchi, which was a kind of Japanese plastic robot toy, pet, if you like. It didn't look like a pet. And there was the Tamagotchi Effect. And this was where basically people were neglecting aspects of their life, neglecting to feed the cat or phone their grandmother, because they were playing, they were keeping their Tamagotchi alive, and their time was taken up with that distraction. So that is a form of addiction, and clearly is a potential harm. And if you're interested, if anyone's interested, my partner and I, not my partner, my colleague and I published this paper back in 2020 at the International Conference on Robot Ethics and Standards, with a case study of a robot teddy bear. Okay, so yes, so let me move. This is the final segment of the talk. On to just introduce very briefly transparency, and this is the standard that I've been working on as a volunteer, chair of a working group, again, of volunteers. So what do we mean by transparency? Well, we define transparency in this way. A system is transparent if it's possible to discover why it behaves in a certain way, in particular, why it made a particular decision. And of course, that's an easy thing to say, but can be very hard to achieve, particularly for so-called deep learning systems based on artificial neural networks. We also define in P7001 explainability, and we define it like this, that a system is explainable if the way it behaves can be expressed in plain language, understandable to non-experts. So transparency, if you like, is transparency to everybody, but a subset of that is transparency to non-experts. And the important thing that we realized, and I'm sorry that I've lost a bit of the bottom of the slide here, but the important thing that we realized in writing this standard is that transparency is not one thing. So if you think about an elderly person with an assisted living robot, she doesn't need to understand her care robot in the same way that the engineer who repairs it does. So she needs transparency, but the transparency that she needs is very different to the transparency that the repair engineer needs. So we ended up defining 5, in fact, stakeholder groups, and defining different measures of transparency for each one of those. So we have transparency for safety certification engineers or agencies, for accident investigators, that's a key group, for lawyers or expert witnesses, and then for non-experts, we have 2 groups, users, and it's fallen off the bottom of the slide, and the general public, the wider public, because of course these AIs and robots are in the world that we're all part of, so we all need some level of transparency of what they're doing, you know, how they work and what they're doing, especially if they're in our urban spaces, in our workspaces, and so on. So taking accident investigators as a good example, Marina Jarokra and I wrote this paper back in 2017 called The Case for an Ethical Black Box. And we made the proposition, very simple proposition, that all robots, and in fact, by extension, AIs, should be fitted with the robot or AI equivalent of a flight data recorder. In other words, a data logger. And our argument is very, very simple, which is that, that without such a device, you cannot possibly figure out what went wrong when there is a robot or AI accident. In other words, when harm is caused. And I should have said earlier that lots of harms are being caused already. In fact, if you look on the internet, there's a database called the AI Incidents Database, which contains hundreds of accidents or incidents, near misses, in which both robots and AIs are implicated. So it's not that these harms are not happening already, they're happening already, but mostly they're not being investigated, which means that whatever went wrong, which may be technical or it may be operational, is not being fixed. Now, we think that's very serious, a serious deficit. And P7001 builds into the standard that robots and AIs, autonomous systems, should be fitted with such a device. So that's built into the standard because it's essential for accident investigators. That's part of the evidence base that accident investigators will need. And then for users, well, we think in the standard that users provide the kind of explainability that builds trust. So for instance, an elderly person should be able to say to the robot, "Robot, why did you just do that?" And the robot should be able to give a simple answer, like, I stopped because I thought I might bump into you, something like that. And a more advanced level of explainability would be, "Robot, what would you do if I fall down?" And the robot should be able to say, "Well, if you fall down, I will raise the alarm." Or what would you do if I forget to take my medicine? These are reasonable questions which a user of a robot, a naive, non-expert user, should be able to ask. So again, we built those kinds of transparency measures into the standard. And it's important to say, I think this is almost the very end, that transparency does not come for free. So, even well-designed systems are not transparent automatically. And really, we need process standards for transparency, i.e. processes of design, manufacture and test deployment, which are themselves transparent. We need technical standards, and of course P7001 is that. And we need technologies like the ethical black box. The reason we call it an ethical black box is because it would be irresponsible not to have one, very simply. And we also need accident investigation for intelligent systems. And in fact, that's something I'm working with. And this is the end. So the project that Marina Girotka and I have, 5-year project, is called RoboTips. And we're working on both the EBB and robot accident investigation. And also I've put references to a number of papers I've not mentioned, including a paper on robot accident investigation, a paper on the P7001 standard, which is in Frontiers in Robotics and AI, and a paper with a lot of other authors on governing AI safety through independent audit. Not all of those papers are open source, but if you want a copy, just let me know and I can send you a copy of any paper that's not open access. So I'm sorry that was rather breathless and fast, but I hope it made sense. So I'd be very happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. This was very exciting. It really opens up. It's really food for thought, I think, also for people and our ESRs who are working in AI and are developing deep learning models. And what happens now when we want to translate this to the clinic, and what about ethical aspects, or the black box, as the patients or the medical doctors are often referring to those type of models. Are there questions from Paris?
Yeah, a fascinating talk and a lot of food for thought, indeed. I'm wondering now, when we talk about the black box idea is fascinating. I'm wondering, even outside of AI, what if there's a medical incident today that doesn't even involve AI? We have the equivalent of a black box. Do we understand why treatment goes wrong, etc. in that space? And what does our limited ability, and I think probably the answer is a qualified no, at least, in many cases. I don't know, I would be interested in your view on this, and what does our maybe limited ability to deal with, let's say, such accidents now mean for our vision of how we maybe achieve more of that also for AI?
No, that's a great question, and I really do not know the answer, but like you, I rather suspect very limited data logging. But I'm going to ask that question of a good friend and colleague who is advising the RoboTips project, and he's a professor at University of Nottingham, and he is an expert in air accident investigation, but he also lobbied and helped to found the new National Health Accident Investigation Bureau in the UK, which we believe is the world's first such dedicated accident investigation bureau for health systems. So I should ask him that question when I speak to him next. But I suspect the answer is, as you suggested, probably very limited.
Thanks again for a fantastic talk. We have another question in the room.
Where should I look? Okay. Hello. Thank you for the talk. I just want to ask a question. Very maybe very stupid, but like anyway. Do you to which extent do you think that the existing tools that we are using in order to develop AI are really gonna be disruptive for actually implementing an AI that really function in the context of in the clinical context? What I mean is basically we are ledgering the AI on so many other pre-existing learning methods, so deep learning, machine learning, federated learning, swarm learning, and then we have AI that is built basically on all those pre-existing methods. But we developed, during the years, many different coding languages, many different tools, many different programming languages. But I have the strong feeling, but I'm not an expert in the field, nor in the slightest, and I'm just trying right now to face the AI. I have the feeling that maybe what we are using right now is not exactly what we actually need to really build up an AI model that is able to predict, in the best way, anything.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's very notable that right now, safety critical systems, there is no safety critical system on the planet that uses an artificial neural network. Not one. So ANNs are not used in aircraft autopilots, on train systems, on safety systems. They're not used, for emergency plant shutdown systems. Why is that? Well, it's because we cannot formally prove the correctness of an AI, in other words, we can prove the correctness of an good old-fashioned AI, which is basically hand-coded. It's called good old-fashioned algorithmic AI. But AI is based on machine learning that have been trained using training data sets. We can only really get a kind of statistical view about whether the AI is adequate, and that of course is not good enough for safety critical systems. Now my view is that medical systems, health systems, are safety critical. Of course they are. I mean, some of them we hope. Well, we hope that, for instance, medical diagnosis AIs are not used to make diagnoses. In other words, that they're only used as a sort of third opinion, not even a second opinion, by the clinician. So in other words, it's the clinician that should make the decision of the diagnosis, not an AI. It would be very dangerous to use an AI as the sole diagnostic tool. So I think the use of AI in medical systems is potentially very, very problematical. And in fact, I was at a panel meeting in London last week, the first one since before the lockdown, face to face, which was exciting. And on the panel was both health systems AI developer working within the NHS and a health systems regulator from the UK regulator of health systems. And what's very interesting, and I was very encouraged to discover, is that they have, there are very robust processes for approving medical and health AI systems, because essentially the same rules apply to non-AI systems, and certainly there are, I heard about examples of kind of AI apps that were being marketed for self-diagnosis, perhaps of mental illness, and the regulator has said to the manufacturer, "I'm sorry, you cannot use this. This is not regulated. It is illegal, therefore, under UK legislation for that app developer to continue to market the app." Of course, they can get it approved, but they'd have to supply a vast amount of documentation, and many app developers simply don't understand that they have the approvals process is extremely demanding, and often they simply, if they're not aware of it before they start development, then they almost certainly won't have the information they need to seek approval.
Which is also a bit related to the topic of transportability, right, and transferability. So where if you change the data set, then often you get different results out from an AI and machine, and this is of course very dangerous, right, in practice, because you don't know all the characteristics of the individual that is sitting in front of you.
Yes, that's right, and certainly part of the approvals process for an AI system, a machine learning system, would be to examine very carefully the provenance and the degree to which the training data set is appropriate and has been curated and designed to for that particular application. As you say, it would be completely unacceptable to simply scrape data from the internet and use that. And no wonder that many facial recognition systems are biased, because that's how they collect the data. Very bad practice. So anyway, it was a great question. Thank you.
Thank you for answering.
You're welcome.
Any other questions from the audience? I'm in the meantime checking the chat, and I do not see any question from our participants online. If there are no questions from the audience in Paris, then I thank you again, Professor Winfield. This was a very interesting talk, and yeah, I'm sure some of us will get back to you to have some further discussions, or maybe ask for some references. Yeah.
Sure. Yes, and so please email me directly if anyone has questions. A pleasure to meet you, Christelle, and to participate eventually, because I think we were originally going to do this 2 years ago. So
yeah, okay, thank you very much, and
your project.
Stay safe. Yeah.
You too.
Next
Bye-bye.
speaker is Alfonso Valencia. He's a professor and director of the Life Science Department at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center in Spain. And he's also the director of the Spanish National Bioinformatics Institute and heads the Spanish node of the European Bioinformatics Infrastructure Elixir. And we all had a talk before the lunch, while Frederik Coppens was explaining some key characteristics of Elixir. So he has received many rewards and appreciations, has an age index of around 120. And if I have to briefly summarize what his group is doing, then it would be applying machine learning and artificial intelligence to precision medicine, including the development of various software platforms to extract, to integrate, and to represent big data in large-scale genome projects. So, Alfonso, the floor is yours, and I hope you will be able to upload your slides soon.
Well, thank you for the invitation to give this talk in the winter school. Let me see if I can share my screen.
Excellent. Yeah.
It's working. It's always magic. Okay.
Yep.
So what I'm going to do is to focus in one specific problem that we have been working the last few years, and is related with the analysis of information cases from rare disease cases using this type of approaches based on multi-layer networks. And I will divide this talk with my colleague, Davide Cirillo. I will present you the cases and explain the general idea and what we are doing. And then Davide will go a little bit deeper into what are multi-layer networks from the methodological point of view and also from the user point of view, how you can use them. What type of information, what are the software, and the methods and the references to use multi-layer networks. So I try to divide this in sort of 15 minutes for my part and half an hour for Davide, and then happy to answer questions afterwards. So these are the elements of what I want to tell you about. So first are rare diseases. I will show you two examples. Obviously, there are many others. Obviously, the characteristic of rare diseases is that always the number of cases is small. Otherwise, they will not be rare diseases. And this is true for rare diseases, but it's also true more and more for medical problems in general. The more we understand diseases, the more we subdivide them in smaller classes, and therefore we have a smaller number of patients for each one of them. So I think this is an increasingly important problem also beyond the area of rare diseases. How to analyze when you have, and you will see the examples later, a handful of cases. In this case, you will not be able to use all the wonderful tools of statistics based on very large number of cases. You will not be able to train neural networks with many cases because there are just not that many cases. So we are referring to this area of medicine that is characterized by these properties. At the same time, even if we don't have many cases, the cases that we are discussing, the example we are working with, you have a reasonable amount of additional information that has been obtained from the patients. Could be genomic information, could be some proteomic information, some epigenetic information. So you are adding to this additional, deep omic information to some level, depending on the experimental setup. Plus, you have a lot of external information. Obviously, even if you don't know much about these examples or these particular individuals, you know a lot about other databases that are relating proteins, genes, etc. So there is a full wall of databases that you can use to combine with this information. Now, the next question is, now we have some information about some individuals, a lot of information on databases, how we combine all these together, and there are many different ways of integrating information. The one we are using here are multi-layer networks. So essentially, we try to represent each one of the different type of information, gene expression and values, phosphoproteomic data, drug interactions or drugs administrations, in different layers. In each one of the nodes in the layer will be, for example, a gene, and the connections are the connections that are known from experimental data, from the external information. For example, similarity between expression patterns for different genes. Then the algorithmic is how to combine this information across the different layers to find associations, clusters, or paths that will cross the different layers. And then there is a full set of algorithms, and we'll discuss the one we have used to do that, to refine and to extract from these multi-layers what I call here the key elements. You can imagine that in the case of a human disease, the key elements can be the genes that may be responsible of this disease. So the question is how to use all this information is from the experimental setup or from external databases, how to combine them and how to use this in this multi-layer framework to extract information that are relevant for the cases, for example, the genes that are potentially responsible of the given disease. So that's the general thing, and what I'm going to do is to show you how we went about into specific cases to follow this path from left to right. So the first one is a very rare disease. It's called congenital myasthenic syndrome. There are different types of congenital myasthenic syndrome. All of them are related with it's a neuromuscular disease. So they're not related with this transmission of information from the neurons to the muscles, to the muscular contraction. And in this case, the disease is at the genetic level is easy to characterize because there are mutations in a acetylcholine receptor. So the molecular characterization is these cases have the disease because they have a mutation in this particular gene that makes that the signal transmission from the neurons to the muscle cells doesn't work well. Being this true, being the main cause of the disease, the degree of severity of the disease changes a lot. There are cases that are very, very severe to cases that are really very mild. And the question here is, can we use the genomic information and the rest of the information to try to understand what are the molecular bases of this difference between severe and not severe cases, even if all of them has this pathway altered to some degree. And then the number of cases is really very small. There are 20 cases in this study. Probably there are more, but these are the ones in the study, divided in severe and not severe, 8 and 12. So it's a really very small number of cases. As I say, all of them has this causal mutation and homozygous mutation in the receptor. Now, from these cases, we get a number of omic information, essentially GWAS, full genome, and RNA-seq information, and then we put together with this information from databases, Interactome, Metabolome, and Reactome. We extract from these compound heterozygous variants, copy number variants. We also know the causal genes, the genes that are directly related with the disease. And then we put this into the multi-layer network. So that's essentially the path I told you about before. What we want to do with this is to understand what is the relation between these causal genes that are mutations in the receptor and other genes that are the ones that are influencing the degree of severity of the disease. And to do that, what we develop is an algorithm that goes through this multi-layer network and trying to go in different degrees of clustering. The more in the upper part is a very large cluster, so all the genes, including the ones that are known to be related with the disease, will be part of the cluster. The more we go into reducing the size of the clustering, making a cluster more stringy, the cluster becomes small, and we try to identify those clusters that the implicated genes in the cluster remain stable, remain together across the full clustering process. In other words, it's a way of saying if there is a set of genes that in this set of multi-layers, they have a strong link with them and they are related with these causal genes, these are the ones that are more likely to be responsible of the symptoms of the disease. And then later we will see in a little bit more detail how the algorithm is working. At the same time, I would say it's not a very complicated one. So we want to have a balance between the level of clustering, not too big, not too small, and being able to keep together in a given cluster the causal genes together with the other potentially associated genes. That's the balance that we want to keep and to find a level of resolution in which we can achieve that. So another representation of doing that is we start with a big set of genes that are connected across all these different layers of the multilayer. So this is after integrating them in a multilayer. And then we go progressively clustering and clustering in smaller clusters. And this set of genes, the purple genes, are the ones that stay together along the full clustering process. And therefore they are associated, and they are very likely to be associated with the disease because in this set of genes, the causal genes are included. And that's the interpretation of the results. So these are a set of genes. The one in purple are the ones that are known to be related with neuromuscular interfering with the neuromuscular signaling system. The one in blue are genes that are probably compound heterozygous variants. We have already observed that, and the ones in yellow is a gene that is end up in this cluster because it's coming from the analysis of the copy number variants that was done initially. Different individuals in this small set of cases, we have affected different genes in this cluster. So the different severity of the disease is interpreted as what is the combination of these genes that give more or less severe cases, and indeed different combinations of these genes are affecting two different molecular functions, complementing the essential transmission of information in the neuromuscular junction. So the biological interpretation, without entering too much into the details, this is the basic clustering of the receptors that is fundamental for the signal transduction, but then there are other related functions associated to these other complementary genes, including glycosylation pathways, including mitochondrial functions and neuron functions that signal movement of vesicles on the neurons that are implicated in the process. So there is a molecular level interpretation of the degree of severity. One of the interesting things from my point of view of this study is that most of the genetic studies on rare diseases are focusing on finding the causal genes because that's the main thing to do. There are far less work done in finding all these other accessory genes of which the severity of the diseases depend on. And I think this is interesting. This is the complementary information that you really need to understand, need to know to be able to understand how the manifestations of the disease, and in a sense to understand the full biological process behind the disease. In this case, some of these genes, as I say, they are already known to be related with neuromuscular transmission. Others are not. What we have done in collaboration with Lockmuller Lab in Canada, they have this fish model in which they can knock out the equivalent genes, the homologous genes to the one we are proposing, trying to demonstrate that the ones that were not known to be part of this neuromuscular transaction system are indeed part of the system. And what you see in the experiments and the significant errors is what they mean is that by mutating these genes, indeed the fish move less or move with difficulties, indicating a difficulty in the movement, therefore in the neurological, in the neurotransmission to the muscles. So that's at least I think it's a good sign that the genes that we are implicated in the disease without knowing that they are implicated in the molecular process, they are indeed part of the molecular process. So that's one of the two cases we have been working on. The second one is related with another rare disease. This is a child cancer, medulloblastoma. This there are a lot of work done in this cancer. There are 4 main groups. 2 of them are very well characterized at the pathological level, but also medical level, but also at the molecular level, because the causal main genes or the causal main pathways are well known, but there are the 2 groups, group 3 and group 4, that are less clear or less well known at the molecular level, and they are more difficult to distinguish at the medical level or at the molecular level. It is interesting that this classification of the disease in 4 groups, that is important for the diagnosis, but also for the possible treatments and for the drugs that are already tried against the disease. This classification is mainly based on molecular patterns. So it's one of the few diseases in which the main classification is done based on molecular information and not on symptoms. So more or less the same approach than in the previous slide. In this case, these are the 4 groups. You can imagine this is a child cancer. There are not many cases. It's difficult to obtain samples. So we are talking here about 100 of cases, not 20 like in the previous case, but not 1,000 like in any other, the typical large-scale cancer study. The current classification, as I say, is based on this large collection. We are using patterns with to combine omic information of up to 14,000 possible genes. And essentially what we try to do is to provide a classification that will still classify the cases in these 4 groups, because they are the ones that are accepted at the medical level and make sense, but will produce a classification that is good and is stable, but will be based not in 40,000 genes, but in a smaller number of genes that will also make easier the molecular interpretation. And again, to do that, we are combining the information that is obtained from the cases, the viable experimental information, with the information that is accessible in databases. So it's a combination of patient information with database information. Then you can see this as we put all this in the multi-layers, and we obtain the similar to the other case, the path. You can see this also as an optimization problem. We try to have these groups classified in the best with the minimal number of genes. Obviously, if we use this the full genome, we can obtain a very good classification. But the question is to do this with less genes. And if you try to do with the very small genes, then the classification will not be very stable. So we are trying to define this as an optimization problem in which you try to find the optimal number of genes to produce a stable classification. And we do this systematically. We compare this with random samples of genes, trying to find if we are able to produce a systematically good classification with a small number of genes. This is the type of association that we are getting, and these are the groups that are produced. As I said, they are the Sony headshot and the wind groups that are clear and they separate well, and the functions are relatively well known or well known. There are the other 2 groups, the G3 and GG4, that are less known, and the relations with pathways is less well established. And at the same time, there's this mixed G3, G4 group that is very difficult to separate with most of the approaches. and does indicate that the characterization of these two groups is not as clear as the one of the other groups. So again, without entering into the technical details of how we do that, because now Davide will go more into how we use the multi-layer networks. The final result, and I will leave it at this level, is that we can go from this initial 40,000 genes that are used to divide the disease in 4 classes to a much smaller set of 1,800 genes that can reproduce the classification of the 4 classes as well as the 40,000 genes with an accuracy of 95%, and obviously we have reduced the dimensionality of the problem by almost 90% in terms of the amount of information that is used to do the classification. So that's the second use of the information. In the first case, we were pointing to genes potentially associated with the disease or with the severity of the disease. In the second case, we are pointing to a core of genes that may be more related with the differences between the 4 groups of the medulloblastoma than the original very large numbers of genes implicated in the classification. So that's, as I said, Davide has been, is the postdoc, has been doing all this work. Iker is the PhD student, as the first author of these 2 papers. There are a lot of people implicated in this work from the 2 diseases, from the rare disease community, or from the child cancer project, and many of these things are developed in collaboration with the Curie group, with Andrei Simojev, and part of the work that we do in the multi-layer networks is in a collaboration with Anaïs Baldot, the former postdoc, that is the one that is pushing very much this area of multi-layer networks and developing algorithms. Let me summarize this, my part of this talk. I think that for us, or in our experience, multi-layer networks are a powerful tool to integrate heterogeneous data set, and it has particularly interesting applications in this case of rare diseases or diseases with very small number of cases. We see this as the possibility of understanding multi-layer networks to derive communities using different scales, and this has been used to discover bioentities related with diseases. The use of the multi-layers to extract trajectories, I think, is a particularly promising approach. We have not, I mean, this is not what I showed you here, or there are many other ways in which you can use the multi-layer information, not only to extract genes like clusters, but also to follow processes on time, what we call trajectories, but that's something else I didn't tell you about today much. And then we use this type of approach of reducing the clusterings and understanding how the entities distribute in the clusters to provide some clues on these diseases, because they provide us with molecular information that we can use in terms of interpreting these in biological terms or biomedical terms, providing what we call here functional analysis. So that's, I guess, is my summary. That, you know, if you are interested in analyzing your data and you have this type of heterogeneous data type, multi-layer networks may be a tool, a type of approach that you may want to consider. And I stop sharing here, if I can find the stop sharing thing. Yep, and now I let Davide to introduce you to the universe of multi-layer networks. Davide.
Okay, thank you so much, Alfonso. Thank you all. for the invitation. So now we are going to delve a bit more into the details of all those approaches and methodologies based on multi-layer network that Alfonso introduced, starting with a gentle introduction to this graph-based framework that, as you see, is essentially using different graphs all at the same time, but with the characteristic of maintaining their topology separated, maintaining their topology as they are, only connecting the different layers among them. And this is extremely relevant, especially for integrating different types of information, heterogeneous information. Like, for instance, in this example, that is not related to the health, and in which we have the transport system in Madrid. You can see we have a layer that is representing the tram path. Then we have the metro, the buses, and as you can see, not all the stations are the same. So you can go from one place to the other using one transport system or the other. And by representing in this way, you can actually see this integration, the possibility of going from one place to the next. So a multi-layer network is essentially a network of networks that are called layers and that are characterized by edges at the level of each network, which are called intralayer edges, and edges that connects the nodes in the different layers, which are called interlayer edges. The connection between the nodes in the different layers can be based on the identity of the node, like, for instance, in this case. So if you have exactly the same entity that is represented in two different layers, you can connect them. But also the connection can happen in a more heterogeneous way. So you can have connections that bridge things that are not the same, and this really depends on how you want to build your multi-layer network, which is also the beauty of this framework. So it really depends on the type of information and how you want to represent it and how you are going to use it. So let's say that for the moment we are just stick with this identity interlayer edges, and we end up with something like this, and this is a multi-layer network. This can get very complicated, especially if you want to use this framework to represent complex, let's say, systems or some events. Like, for instance, this particular multi-layer network that I'm showing here is representing different actions that 4 scientists are doing at 3 conferences. So the 4 scientists are identified by the nodes, and in particular their initials MAP, MB, YYA, and AC. So those are the 4 nodes that we have. And they are doing different things in 3 different conferences: ACCS 2013, a workshop in Oxford, Next for Science 2013. And basically what they are doing is either talk to each other or went to a talk by another of those speakers. So what I'm showing here is like, you know, a very complex system in which basically you can use a multi-layer network to represent different aspects that happen at the same time, being at a conference in one dimension, and do something specific in another dimension. So this is an example of how complex can get this kind of representation, and how useful also the type of analysis that you can do here can be. But it can get also even more complex. Indeed, for instance, you can merge together multi-layer networks. Like, for instance, in this case, we have a multi-layer network in which the interlayer edges are based on the identity, no, of the nodes. But then you can, for instance, have an heterogeneous network, and you want to combine the 2 things. So you will end up with something that is called heterogeneous multi-layer network, in which essentially you have one part that is represented by a simple multi-layer network, and then connection to another type of network, and the sum of the 2, like this object, is called an heterogeneous multi-layer network. So it's a very flexible, essentially, framework upon which you can apply all the, let's say, methodologies and all the principles that you generally use in graph theory. Indeed, talking about graph theory in a more formal way, the difference between a monolayer network and a multilayer network can be expressed in this way. So a monolayer network is essentially defined by nodes and edges, and this is very simple, is the type of networks that we are all familiar with. And those networks can be of different types, can be undirected, directed, can be bipartite graphs, path graphs, tree graphs, directed acyclic graphs, all the different types of graphs and networks that we are used to. But if we want to use all those monolayer networks into a multi-layer networks, what we have to do is essentially to find another type of formalization, another way of describing it. And in particular, in the case of multi-layer networks, like this one, for instance, just 2 layers, we can follow this formalization. So you can see that a multi-layer network is characterized not only by the nodes that are present inside this object and the different layers, in this case, 2 of them, but also by the connections of the different nodes in the different layers, as well as the connection between the different nodes in different layers among them. So yes, this is just like a way of describing in a more formal mathematical way those objects. And as I showed you before, this can be very, very complex as well. So, so complex that indeed there is an active research under development, and we are witnessing this. For instance, there are many tools that have been implemented, and also like many, let's say, processes, many things that are studied using a multi-layer network framework. Most of this work stemmed in the past from physics. These actually come from the field of physics, in which they were interested in studying specific dynamical processes, like, for instance, diffusion, structural transitions. So all this, let's say, body of work that comes from actually another field from physics is being uptaken by biology and medicine, and indeed more recently those frameworks have been more and more used. Okay, so going practical, how you can build a multi-layer network. So you have basically many options because you can use this framework in which, for instance, the node can represent different things. The nodes can represent genes, but maybe you want to build a multi-layer network in which the nodes represent patients and the edges associations among those patients. Or even you want to go even higher, at a higher level, in which the nodes represent diseases and the connection, some kind of association between diseases. So it really depends on the type of bioentities or, well, nodes that you want to study. But in general, the way in which you build those structures is depend on the type of data that you have. So if this is a structured data, like for instance in the case of databases in which those associations are encoded, for instance in a tabular way, you can build your networks retrieving the information directly from there. Like for instance, here we have 5 layers in which the associations represent different things, like for instance, molecular interactions, targeting drug, variant associated disease, many other things. And those comes from specific databases, like for instance, BioGrid. From BioGrid, you can take the molecular interactions. From KEGG, you can have targeting drugs, and so you can connect genes that are targeted by the same drug. The same as for diseases, you can pick associations from the GWAS catalog and connect the genes based on the variants that are associated to maybe the same disease, and so on and so forth. Even metabolites from other databases react on for pathways. So yes, you can basically construct those multi-layer networks from databases depending on information that is contained. Of course, once you have built this multi-layer network, you can study this object, and you can, for instance, see that the degrees of those genes, of those nodes inside each networks is follow different distribution. And you can, for instance, have different connected components. And this is really, really nice, because each layer is basically reflecting a different topology, a different feature that you are somehow integrating into one single object that you can analyze comprehensively. What generally happens when you do this is that if you look, for instance, at the overlap between nodes or edges in the different layers, generally those overlaps are not very high. Like, for instance, in those 5 layers that comes from those 5 databases, you can see that the number of genes that are in common in the different layers is very few, but there are like higher number in different configuration. And this is part of the, let's say, the purpose of creating this. Like the actual goal here is to try to integrate as much information as possible, even if this information is partial in some bits. In the case of ages, sometimes it can also be even worse. Like, for instance, in this case, there are no ages that are in common between the different layers, but still there are ages that are in common in different places of the multi-layer network, and this is the characteristic that we are exerting here. You can build multi-layer network also using unstructured data, for instance, texts, and in order to do this, you need, first of all, a processing of the text in order to extract the information. If you want to build a multi-layer network based on genes, for instance, you can tag the name of the genes from the text. And once you have this, you can actually end up with something like this. This is an example that comes from the European project, IPC, in which we are collaborating. And basically, you can see that you have like a complex network of words that are extracted from texts, and those words you can actually connect to information that is coming from other types of layers that represent molecular information, like, for instance, methylation, RNA-seq, and so on and so forth. So you can also, combining text mining and information coming from the literature with molecular information coming from, for instance, experiments or even the databases that I was mentioning before. So there are many metrics that you can use for studying your multi-layer network, and I'm going to just mention a couple which I find particularly interesting. The first of all is called participation coefficient, and this is really an intuitive metric because it is essentially measuring how one specific node is participating in the different layers. So how many times you can see this node having connection in the different layers. Like, for instance, if we have a multi-layer network of different social media, like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and the node that I am analyzing is this guy here, you can see that this node has a high participation coefficient because it has connections in many different layers. Instead, this other node is very focused on one specific layer, in this case, LinkedIn. And so this particular node will have a low participation coefficient. You can also have, people that is interacting a lot in those social media everywhere. And so, like, for instance, this would be the case of a very high, a node with a very high participation coefficient. So this is a nice metric that is very easy to compute. Is based on the overlapping degree of each node in the different layers. And you can see, for instance, like here, the edges are colored based on the connection at the different levels. And you can see that something that has a high correlation coefficient has many colors because it's connecting things in different layers, while something that is very much focused in the green layer here, it has a low participation coefficient. So if you apply this to the genes, for instance, that comes from this multi-layer network of databases that we were mentioning before, you can actually use the participation coefficient to rank your gene. And you will discover that the ones that has a higher participation coefficient, which in particular, like for this particular multi-layer network are those ones, will be like, genes that are connecting many different things and performing many different actions in the different layers. Yes, which of course is very interesting, not to have a metric, not to discover them. Another one is a metric that we introduced, is called multilayer community trajectories, and Alfonso briefly mentioned before, and essentially is based on the definition of a multilayer network community. You can find communities in multilayer network by maximizing a property that is called modularity, which here is indicated as Q. So the maximization of the sum of the modularities in each layer given a certain partition is a way of finding those communities. Now, as you can see, this modularity Q is parameterized with a parameter that is called the resolution, and essentially the resolution governs the size of the partition, the size of the community that you are trying to maximize. And so, if you look at how if you change the value of the resolution, you can see that you are going from very big communities to smaller and smaller and smaller communities, the higher this modularity resolution. Something that we noticed is that some nodes, or if you want, some genes, tend to be always in the same communities, no matter the value of the modularity resolution. And so we basically exploit this property in order to identify the trajectories of the genes within those different community structures. And we call these multi-layer community trajectories. We can compute this for all the genes or the nodes that are contained in a multi-layer network. And the way we compute this is the following. So basically, first of all, you find the community structure of your multi-layer network at different value of resolution. Then you label all those communities. And then for each gene, essentially, you create vectors with all those communities, and you can see how close are those vectors for each gene among them. You can end up with a distance matrix, and with this distance matrix, you can, for instance, represent in a dendrogram, no? Using, for instance, here in this case, the Hamming distance. And you can represent this, as I said, in a dendrogram that is really, really complex and with a lot of information inside that we can actually use, for instance, to study how distant inside these three are genes of interest, or maybe also like how the community composition changes along this procedure. So to conclude, I would like to recommend some tools for multi-layer network analysis of different types. So for instance, this trajectory analysis that I was describing is implemented in an R package called CMMD that we published this year. And then other tools are, for instance, tools for finding communities inside a multi-layer network. And one is called Multi. It has been used in a Dream Challenge. And you can perform random walks inside the multi-layer network. And here is another tool. And then you can also, apply representation learning to multi-layer networks. And for instance, in order to find node embeddings, so vectorial representations for each node that took into account all the connectivities in the entire multi-layer network. And this is called, and this is a tool that has been published very recently, and it's called Multiverse. So, okay, the conclusions are essentially like the same that were explained before. So this is very useful, in particular for the study of rare diseases, and I highly recommend you to, read more about this topic and to use the tools in order to, have a more comprehensive and holistic view of the systems that you are studying in your work. So thank you so much to all the collaborators for your attention, and yes, if there are questions, we are glad to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Davide.
Thank you. Are there questions from Paris?
Questions from the ESR? Yes, there's one. Make them. You want to step up?
Hello, I'm
Hello.
Mehmet. Thank you so much for your nice presentation. My main question is that maybe I missed something here, but you mentioned in the actually the application that you mentioned with the first section, you mentioned there are some gene modules. But my question is, was it the only gene module that you detected and you showed and was relevant, or you had other gene modules that also were relevant, but you just or others were not relevant, but this one was only relevant? But the other question is that sorry. Okay. The other is that you find the gene clusters or gene sets only on severe samples. And so did you also compare them with non-severe cases to see whether these gene modules are also are relevant, or are these genes are also remain together with in different severity, or no, it is different?
So I can answer the question. The two actually those are related. So yes, we did that. So first of all, there are other modules. The one that we show is the largest that contains genes that are altered somehow. So the copy number variants, the others mutated genes. And that is just the largest one, but there are many other, and actually in the paper we describe all of them. And then another thing is that yes, we are also considering the non-severe cases. This is actually, at the end of the day, is a kind of a classification problem. So we have those two classes and we want to distinguish them. So this is also part of the task. So the modules that you saw, the model that we showed was not just the biggest that contains the mutations, but is also the one that is discriminate the patients that are severe from the patients that are not severe. So yes, but it's really interesting because there are actually like other modules that contains other genes, and we can actually rank them by importance based on this discrimination task that was in the first place.
Okay. So how did you compare? If you find, for example, some gene modules in severe cases and some gene modules in non-severe cases, how do you compare and how do you conclude upon these findings?
We found that different parts of the pathway are affected. Actually, the severe cases are very specific for like the how can I say, the processes of the neuromuscular junction functions that are affected in the severe cases are different from the ones of the non-severe cases. In particular, in the severe cases, that was very much related to the clustering of the receptor. So this is really interesting also from a physiological point of view. So in order to induce the muscle contraction, you need to cluster all those receptors in the synapses so that they can receive a lot of neurotransmitter, and this can induce a strong contraction of the muscle. In those severe cases, essentially this clustering is affected, so they end up with few receptors that are there, and on top of that they are mutated, so they are even less functional, and so this lead to a weaker ability in contracting the muscle. In the case of the non-severe cases, that was related to other processes, but we could actually pinpoint them, and it was really interesting to see how the system that was this neuromuscular junction, and all those different mutations that were placed in different spots. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So you compare with respect to the interpretation then?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. We really, actually, I mean, Iker, the PhD student, really went down to the actual mechanism. It was like a big work, and yes, but at the end we could provide really mechanistic explanation, which actually are even related to the drug that is generally used in those myasthenic cases.
Or was it also included in the objective function, the discriminative that you needed to discriminate? also
discrimination,
in
yes. The discrimination, yes. The interpretation, of course, well, not. This has been done a posteriori, but it was really fascinating, to see those things, popping out from the.
I think that
there is a question from the online participants. Isn't the participation coefficient biased to find things like household genes, proteins that interact with many things, but that might be irrelevant for a disease? Maybe it's linked to a question I had in part. Are you interested also in looking at the significance of a participation coefficient?
Yes, and then it's definitely biased towards the knowledge that has been accumulated. So, some genes are more studied than others. And so, like, for instance, if you build a multi-layer network from databases, you will have to correct somehow for this. Also, you can also weight the participation coefficient by this. Because yes, you can have this problem. You find something that is very participative, but it's not reflecting the actual activities of this gene, but just how many people worked on this gene. You know what I mean? So yes, it's definitely something to keep in mind, and it's something that can be corrected.
And have you looked at significance of a participation coefficient? So if it's you rank the genes on the basis of participation coefficient, the higher to low, but is high really significantly low? Does it make sense to look at it?
We haven't really done this. We just ranked the genes based on this metric, but I think it's something that can be done. And one way of doing this, for instance, is by removing one by one the layers and see how this participation change. So maybe you can have a bias coming from one specific layer, or maybe you can significance you can compute by randomization or other approaches. But yes, it's definitely something that needs to be done. I mean, the metric itself is not enough.
This problem of significance is a very interesting problem, because at the same time these layers can be really very different. You can imagine from very big and connected ones to very sparse and small ones, and obviously the small and sparse will tend to dominate the others, because then you need a path to go through them. So I think that there is still a lot of to do in terms of understanding the importance and contribution in a way that you can differentiate. What is driven by having very few nodes and everything having to be connected with what is the actual biological contribution or importance for the problem. So I think that everything goes very well when things are very equilibrated, but as soon as the layers are not very well equilibrated, we are not running in a number of problems that are, I would say, are not completely solved or are not solved yet.
Yeah. Benno, is there any question from the ESRs still?
There's one more. If I may, I also would have one.
Yeah.
Well, first off, it's really wonderful that you got back to mechanism and had a complete story there, back to the biology. Really like that. My question was related to the general framing, how Alfonso, you introduced multi-layer networks, and I was wondering whether, you motivated it by the few data that is, or the few samples that we have in rare diseases, but I always feel that I have too little samples. So would you say, this method is complementary, or this approach? Is there anything to what you said that is specific to rare diseases, few samples, or is there not much to add? Does it play out like potential?
I think you can obviously apply the same thing even if you have more samples. But if you have a lot of samples, then there are other factors to take into account, because then you will are weighting the similarity between the samples and the importance, and there are other statistics that you can do with the data. I think that we are not focused in this problem because there are not that many solutions for this problem. So it's the other way around. The methodology in general can be applied to other problems, but maybe there are not many methodologies that can be applied to this problem.
Agreed. There's one more questions here from the room.
Yes, thank you again for your talk. And I'm glad that already question about the significance in QC was asked. It was one of my question list. And I'm wondering what kind of validation strategy you follow in your lab. So in order to justify the results you have, because the one strategy that I have in my mind is perturbation experience, or some kind of targeting the hub genes or hub entities in this network and see the network dynamics afterwards. But I also assume that it's not the most advanced or not the only one that could be. So could you please comment on the validation or further network exploration, if there is any? Thank you.
Yes, so it depends on the type of validation that you are referring, because, for instance, like the most straightforward is the experimental validation that we actually also performed in the zebrafish example. So we spotted some candidates genes, and we are performing experiment in order to see if the findings make sense. In terms of validating the results, like from a computational point of view, something that you can do is well, you can look at the literature. For instance, if you find that some some processes are enriched, and this is something that we actually do in the medulloblastoma paper, in which we apply this. We see, like, of all those networks of all those modules that we find, which are the pathways that are more enriched, which are the molecular functions that are more enriched, and we compare this with experts, with what is known, and so like retrieving this information from the literature, or even like talking directly with people that are clinical doctors or experts in the field. Other ways I was mentioning before, for instance, to check for the robustness of the results. So independently from all the information that you are accumulating to build those multi-layer networks, you can probably like try to remove pieces, like, for instance, remove systematically the layers and see how robust is your finding, and see, for instance, if these depend from specific activities or from specific layers, from specific aspects of the system, and things like that. So perturbing the system in order to have an idea of your results. Yeah, so I would say those three strategies.
Yeah, thank you. And another last question is related actually to, I would like to ask your point of view on the limits and some kind of drawback that you deal with. So, for example, of course, the data availability and data quality is the biggest limit, but how would you rank further limits of like computational or some other restriction which you have in your work?
Yes, so from a computational point of view, all the tools that we are using are very much optimized. So we really have never encountered. I mean, it's also true that we are the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, so it's probably not a bit, but in general, like those tools are really like optimized in order to to perform computation in a very slim and easy way. So I would not say that, but the most limitation is more conceptual. Is more that all this depends on how you build the multi-layer network, and you can build those multi-layer networks in thousands of ways, millions of ways. So it's really like hypothesis-driven type of approach. So you start from an hypothesis and you say, okay, I want to study this, and I will build a multi-layer network with this type of connections, with this type of association, choosing this type of layers of knowledge that I want to take into account. Which is, like, good news, because if you are an expert on the disease, for instance, that you are using, you know where to search, or at least you know where to move. But on the other hand, like you can, as we were saying before, you can indirectly bias in your results. So I would say like a major limitation is probably there, like the decision at the beginning on how to actually build the multi-layer network. This is not probably is not true if you are build the multi-layer network from the multi-omics information that you have. Imagine that you are building a multi-layer network of patients, and you are using patient similarities that comes from your experiment. So this will just be a representation of your data. And in this case, it's okay because it's basically a graph representation of the data that you have for those patients. But if you are building the multi-layer network from external databases, you will have to take some decision, and this is probably the major limitations.
But in fact, if you see it in a bigger perspective of robustness, then it is also mattering in the last example that you give, right? Because if you remove one data source, then and you see that suddenly the entire interpretation changes, then okay, that data source is really pretty informative, probably, you know.
I was going to say something. Yeah, that one of the reasons why we like this area is because it's not finished at all. So there are many open questions. So just to mention one that we have been considering lately is when these networks or these layers are not homogeneous, they contain heterogeneous information. In the simple case, you have genes in all of them. Is what Davide was saying. You have omic data for your data set, and you have gene expression, gene methylation, gene phosphorylation for every gene. That's easy. You connect all the genes across the different layers. But if you want to integrate something that is different and is, has a different granularity, a disease in the layer, then you have to map from genes to diseases or something like that. And these heterogeneous networks are realistic and interesting from the biological point of view because you want to use this information, but the methodology to deal with them is not very developed, I would say. So the limitation is that your imagination runs faster than your methodology, like in many cases.
Mm-hmm. That's a nice statement to close this talk. I thank you very much for your presentations.
Thanks to you.
Yeah, and let's move on to the last speaker of the day.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
So our last speaker is Bertrand de Meulder, and while he's being set up, I will give a short introduction. So he is from the European Institute for Systems Biology and Medicine in France, in Lyon, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
Okay. And so he was educated in bioinformatics and modeling, the tool set, but he got a PhD in biology, an excellent combination to have both, the understanding of underlying biology and the tool set to actually analyze data. But since he started his studies in ecology, he writes that he has always been interested in tackling the complexity of life in its different aspects. And we all know that to make sense of this complexity or to understand parts of a system, we need to develop some tools to represent the data well and to be able to interpret well. And we've already seen lots of examples during the course of this training school, and I'm sure we will see many more during your talk right now. I give the floor to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to present some of my work. So I'm Bertrand de Meulder. I'm going to talk about results coming out of two projects, European large-scale projects. One is called UBioPred. It's a project on severe asthma, and the other is called Ethicists, which is more about providing tools and standards in how to do these types of analysis, among other things. Right, so a bit of background about the terms that I'm going to use here. Usually what we are looking at in the hospitals are called clinical phenotypes. This is how the doctors are describing the version of the disease that they think you have. If they go further, if they have you do a blood test, for example, then we can talk about bioclinical phenotypes, where we can even drill down to molecular level difference in the disease. What we really would like to do is identify endotypes. What are the causes, molecular pathways involved in creating the disease or the version of the disease that you have? And this is an effort of the bioinformatics and health community to try to identify these in different diseases. I'm going to talk about asthma, but this is applicable to many others. Why is this important? As I said, we want to understand pathogenesis. We want to improve how we take care of patients, both predicting how the clinical course is going to happen, predicting how patients are going to react to a therapy, also guiding clinical management. In order to do this, there's a huge subject that is often underrepresented in the courses and the talks is validation, both internal and external. I direct you to this excellent paper by McShane et al. That really goes in depth into how we should do this. There's two papers actually. One is a summary, the other one it goes into more details. Then what is systems biology is using computers and maths to study complex biological systems. There's a lot of procedures and a lot of bioinformatics, biostatistics, modeling, text mining, network analysis. There's a lot of different fields that goes into this, heavily linked to computer science. It's not a coincidence that Barcelona Supercomputing is represented in this talk. Is also can use omics data as a large scale way of gathering data. And systems medicine is applying systems biology in medical situation. It is also called stratified medicine, precision medicine, personalized, translational. All of them are roughly equivalent. I believe you already know this, but in short, what are omics are an ensemble of techniques to measure the abundances of biomolecules in a sample. Can be transcript through transcriptomics, microarrays are a good example. Proteins or lipids through mass spectrometry, for example. Metabolites, breath, or urine, or any other biological medium. It can be many other things. Those are always relative measurements. The question we are asking is which molecules are more or less abundant between two groups of samples. Then what can researchers do with this is get a snapshot of what is happening in a sample at any given time, follow those samples across time points through a time series analysis, identify biomarkers, make models, explain the biology behind the samples, decipher the pathophysiology of the disease, and many other things. As I said, I'm going to talk about examples of severe asthma in the UBioPred project. The idea is that we generated data that we want to, we applied a very strict curation and standards procedure to have really high quality data. That's very important. Then we analyze those data in order to generate hypotheses. Those hypotheses can then be compared with validated, to have a tested hypothesis that usually lead to the development of new technology or new experiments, and the cycle goes on and on. But that can also be compared with the modeling arm, where you take existing hypotheses, do simulation refinements in the computer, try to generate new hypotheses that you then validate. There's another circle going on around here. Outside, output of this is usually taken care of by the pharma industry. It's drug targets and drugs, improved diagnostics through clinical trials, using existing drugs for new uses, so drug repurposing. This is very interesting at the moment. And yeah, this is a summary of this area. So UBioPred, the project, the data I'm using is coming from. It's a project on severe asthma that was running for 6 years up to 2015 and funded by the IMI, so the European Commission, together with the European pharma industries overall. What is the issue? Asthma is a very complex disease. There's a lot of different phenotypes in there that are described in a series of very high level papers. It is very difficult to explain exactly what is your asthma, and also how you move from one definition to another across the course of your disease. The goal of UBioPred was to try to decipher a little bit more this complicated network. The idea is that by taking omics data and integrate them into what we call handprints, we would be able to predict clinical course and therapeutic efficacy, identify new targets in the treatment of severe asthma, and also identify new groups of patients to treat in different ways. So instead of having fixed phenotypes and then looking at what is happening in the different layers, the different omics or classes of molecules, we go the other way around, gather the molecules and then try to find new phenotypes, or even to the point of endotypes. A fingerprint is a biomarker signature derived from a single technical platform. A handprint is from multiple technical platforms, can be combined in any number of ways. There are many different hands to be taken out of the same set of omics data. I'm going to talk about two of them, sorry. This is the overall framework on how we do this type of analysis. We gather the data, we prepare it, we define the groups that we want to identify, either through cohorts or existing biological question. We then find out what a subset of patients we have to work with, filter the features according to the question, perform the clustering, and then find out the biomarkers at the end. In this case, we have a population of a little bit above 600 adult patients, out of which many different biological medium have been taken. And those biological medium have been analyzed in different omics. As you can see, there's a number of, it's not a complete picture, but this is what we are working with. In this case, I'm going to focus on blood and on the different techniques that are used in analyzing the blood of the patients we have gathered to produce handprints. And then we do the clustering. So clustering is really the art of grouping similar things, and it is an art. There's a feeling to it that you acquire when doing it, and although there are many methods, it is difficult to know which one is the right one, which metric you should use, which distance is the right one, and by trial and error, usually you find the right way. One way is to do topology analysis. I have a few references there for you. I'm not going into more details about the math. It's really advanced. The very summarized version is, if you take your hand, you can slice your hand in bins, overlapping bins, and then model your fingers and your hands with what is connected to what. And so you can identify that a finger is 3 nodes that are connected. There's another finger beside this one that is also 3 nodes, but they are not connected until the base of the finger, and so on and so on. And so with this ID, you can represent networks of patients. And so the network that I'm showing here is one example in breast cancer, where the authors of the algorithm could identify 2 subgroups of breast cancer patients that really had different survival. And then they could compare those 2 arms and find out there's a very unique genetic signature between those 2 groups that they can go explore further. In UBioPred, we also use this. For example, this is done on bronchial brushing transcriptomics data, and we just let the algorithm run with the analysis, and then we overlaid the colors based on the existing classification of asthma. And if the existing classification of asthma was completely aligned with the information in this network, then the colors would be exactly separated. You can see it is not the case. There's a mix of severe, non-severe, smokers, non-smokers in all of the groups, which means that there's a lot of other information that is hidden in here. And so when we apply other types of clinical information on this, then we can see that there's, for example, differences in the response to some treatment in those different groups. And so this is interesting because then you can see across diagnoses, there are patients who actually do benefit from a single drug or a type of drug, when as a doctor, you wouldn't prescribe the same drug to the same patients because they are classified differently. So that's one way of revisiting the classification of asthma patients. Another way, this other network is built on sputum proteomics from mass spectrometry. And in this case, it yielded 10 clusters, which we overlaid in color with the granulocytes and the atopy profiles as measured in UBioPred. And then you can see in asthma, usually we like to separate those that have a high number of neutrophil cells from those that have high number of eosinophilic cells. And then you further separate into those populations those that respond and don't to the different medications that we have. In this case, we can see that there is further structure within the eosinophilic group, for example. There are 3 groups that we can identify here that really have different biological profiles, only looking at the proteins. But you can also identify highly atopic, so people that are very allergic, very easily allergic reactions to anything. And we see 2 different profiles in here, again, with very different clinical profiles, but that are currently classified in the same version of the disease. So they have atopic asthma. Another way of doing the cluster, and one that I'm going to focus more on, is called similarity network fusion. So the idea is, in each of the omics platform that you have for the patients, you build similarity networks that you can then fuse using this technique to have a single network that you can then use as input for clustering algorithm. This is what we did. So we combined transcriptomics to proteomics, metabolomics, and then another type of proteomics analysis on chips to try to find clusters of patients. And in this case, you can see the ones that I've highlighted in red are the ones that are most different from what you expect and more stable as well. So when you remove some patients, the groups tend to remain the same. Interestingly, you can then have a story of those groups. So if you focus on the middle bar, this is the 8 clusters that we identified. If you go to the left, you can see that those 8 clusters somehow fuse together when you look at 4 clusters. And if you go to the right, you can see that those clusters further separate into 16 cluster model. We cleaned this a little bit to get to this, and this you have a really clear picture of what is happening. You can see, for example, in cluster 3, when you look at 4 clusters, the blue light, deep blue one, remains separated from the other ones when you look at 8 clusters, and then it separates into 3 subclusters when you look at 16 clusters. And so this is quite interesting, because then you can really take a look at the different levels of separation you can get, and then compare the clusters with each other to find the differences between them. So you do that. You, for example, use a Tukey test to compare the different groups pairwise, and then you find really long lists of, in this case, genes that are differentially expressed between the groups. The question is, what do you do now? Because this huge list is usually useless or so long that it takes way too long to actually analyze or interpret this. The functional analysis is usually the next step. So you use existing tools, can be the website called David or gProfiler, can be commercial tools such as Ingenuity Pathway Analysis or Metacore. We have developed another way, which is called disease maps. In this case, we tackle some of the shortcomings of traditional functional analysis tools, that they are not disease specific, that they don't use standard representation, that they have overlap between the maps that they are usually using. And we can also create new contents in the disease map profile. For example, in here we have a version of disease map for asthma, where you can zoom in from cells and their receptors and the interaction between them, down to more traditional pathways, even down to more precise events in, for example, the methylation of proteins through a zoom similar to Google Maps. And so as an example here, you can see a reconstruction of the information that we got from the experts of asthma into the overall events that are happening at the cellular level in an asthma attack. And then you can overlay the information you get from your clusters and what are different between the groups to this, to see whether there's a pathway that emerges either from the cellular level or the pathway level, traditional pathway level, or down to the molecular events. For example, in this case, here, you have a part of the arachidonic acid metabolism that is overlaid with the protein levels that we can find between two of the groups that we have identified. In red is underrepresented in severe asthma against more moderate asthma. In green, it's more highly represented. Interestingly, in this case, what we see is that there is several repetition of the protein called ALOX5 which is involved in the detoxification of arachidonic acid. And what is very interesting is that this molecule wasn't known to be involved in asthma prior to this. And one of the partners in the project from the pharma side was developing a drug to block the activity of this molecule in a completely different disease. And so they used those results to make a new clinical trial to see whether that drug could be used in some version of asthma based on those results and others that they did later on the line. Then what you would really like to do is to do predictive modeling in a multi-omics setting. I believe you've heard a talk from Professor Lekau that presented this. It's the R package that is called Mix Omics, and this is a version of it which is called Diablo, using multiple omics to identify multi-omics biomarker multi-omics biomarker panels. In the case of UBioPred, for example, we compared a cluster 2, which is severe asthma patients, mostly female, who have a very high number of exacerbations, so asthma attacks recorded, against the rest of the population. On the left, you can see the performances of the model are acceptable, even though there's a lot of more refinement to be done. But interestingly is the middle and the right part. So in the middle, you can see the similarities of the information you get from the different platforms. And so if you cross the first column, which is mRNA, with the second line, which is SomaLogic is a proteomics chip, you can see that they have a 0.47 agreement between the information in those two platforms, which is somewhat expected. Proteins and genes are very similar, biologically speaking, but there's also a whole lot of probably post-translational modification that are captured by the proteins, but not by the gene expression arrays. Similarly, you can see that the difference between metabolomics and gene expression arrays is very large, or the similarities between those is very small, meaning that there's a lot of information that is to be captured in those platforms and underlying the need or the usefulness of having multi-omics analysis. On the right is called a circus plot. There you can see the correlation between the variation of the different classes of molecules. The cutoff to draw a line is at least 70% similarity, so this is very high. This in order to not get too complicated a figure, but then you can see that following a line, the abundance of a gene is very correlated to some expression of a protein, logical, but also to the abundance of some lipids in urine, for example, or to metabolites in the sputum, so the layer that is on the epithelium of the patients, which was a little bit unexpected, but is very interesting to try to identify what is the mechanism between the expression of a gene to the abundance of a metabolite in the sputum of a patient in those types of analysis. Another way is to use random forest. So in this case, it's a decision tree representation to try to separate groups delineating from the group 8 that I showed you earlier. So if I go back here, we are looking at here at the bottom of the figure, you have group 8 that further separates in group 16 and 15. In when you look at 16 clusters, we want to see what is the difference between those. And so you can do this, and you can say that the first parameter to separate is the activity, the abundance of the protein interferon N. Then it goes into a clinical measurement, which is the forced exhaled nitrous oxide level in the air that you exhale. Then it goes into a number of cells in your blood. And then it goes into a number of other cells in your blood. And so you have really a mix of molecular, clinical, and cellular measurements that are routinely taken in the hospital, but that seem to be important in order to separate the two groups that we see that have really different clinical profile down the line. This is really a very quick summary of the work that we're doing here. This is still a lot of work to be done, and we are still publishing papers. Thank you for your attention and the opportunity to talk about this, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there questions from the audience in Paris, our ESRs?
Are we on? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, we do. Thank you again.
So far, no questions on the chat.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. My question regards the clustering that you have done. You know, the multi-scale that you have, you know, different levels of clustering, and you cleaned your clustering to show that your clustering show, you know, yeah, this one. Actually, I was wondering, how did you, you know, do this cleaning?
Oh.
You know, I was, you know.
Yeah, so this is a very arbitrary filter that we used. We said that we would keep a patient in the clustering. So we did this by removing patients that were not together down the line. So if you see, for example, the gray line in cluster 1, do you see my mouse when I do this? Would be easier. Yes. Okay. So if you see this thin gray line here, these patients are outside of the main population coming out of cluster 1 here. And what we said is we remove those if they don't make up for more than 50% of a downstream cluster. It's really arbitrary, but that was a way to really get a clean picture. And the idea, the logic behind this is that we think those patients that are in thin lines are either in the process of transiting from one version of the disease to another, either through normal progression of the disease or medication that is just changed, or they moved to another place and the pollens in the air are different. It can be any number of things. But when removing those patients, we think we're focusing on the core of the clusters that are really there. And it is then the message, the clinical message in comparing them is cleaner down the line. But it's completely arbitrary.
So I was thinking, yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Thanks. I was thinking if, you know, are you using any specific thresholding for that to be, you know, I was considering the issue of reproducibility. If we can, for example, somebody else do this also can, you know, have same results, because maybe if you have considered some thresholds in order to, you know, clean this type.
Yes. So we went from I believe 80% down to 40% membership of a downstream cluster, and the 50% seemed to yield the cleanest image, the cleanest picture of the disease. But yeah, we tried a lot, and there's so many results to be analyzed yet that it maybe we find a better way of doing it, some kind of optimization function based on the similarity profile of the downstream clusters and the number of patients that are eliminated from the filter.
Okay, thank you so much.
That patients on the gray line that you showed, it might actually be a very interesting individual, right, from a precision medicine point of view.
Yes.
Yeah. Of course, it could also be a very extreme one, but maybe very interesting from a clinical point of view.
It could be very interesting if we can go back in the record of that patient, which we cannot do in the project. But I mean, we cannot do for GDPR reasons, but the doctors that are actually treating that patient know who he is and what is his profile. So if we can somehow relay this information to them and telling them what is different in these patients between now and 6 months before you took the analysis, maybe we would have a very interesting hypothesis. Yes.
Other questions from Paris? No question on the chat?
Yes. Yeah, I would have one, if I may.
Yeah. Sure.
Thanks for the nice talk, Bertrand. Interesting to learn about this. You're getting nice things out of your similarity networks. But there was one question. It occurred to me that when you compute this similarity, that's surely a global similarity across everything that you observe, right? So I'm wondering whether the assumption that you're in a way implicitly making that in order to regroup things, it's the global similarity that you're using. It could, to me, it could be also conceivable to have more specific things go wrong in disease. I mean, after all, you all live, these people aren't dead. They're not all wrong, but maybe something specific is wrong about them, and something that you might not easily pick up in a global similarity profile. And I was wondering how you think about that.
Yes, so it is somehow taking part into the algorithm here, and you can tune however you want. If I don't know if it's big enough to see, but in the figure you have different colors between the patients in the networks. Mm-hmm. Those colors are coming from the different omics where the information is coming from. So here it is all in blue. This is similarity in the patients as measured by the mRNA expression. In here it's all pink. It is as coming from the DNA methylation. And then in the end network, you have some links remain from a single platform because they are very strong. Others are common between the platform, and so they have color-coded then in orange. And then some are removed because they are only weakly supported by one type of analysis and not from the others. So yeah, and then you can tune the hyperparameters in the fusion to get more or less of those removed.
So I get that, but still, even each single edge from every single platform is a global measurement over all genes, right?
Well, yeah, you could then filter your input matrices first of all based on clinical feature or interest, say response to a type of medication. Then you have, instead of having 50,000 genes as input, you have maybe 2,000. And then it's much more focused, and you can do the same exercise with much more smaller matrices. Of course, yeah.
I see. What would you filter by if I was interested in a particular disease?
Well, in this case, we didn't filter because we were interested in exactly looking at this, the whole genome, the whole proteome, and so on. But we could, in the case of asthma, for example, filter by the number of exacerbation that you see in a year. And so you would then remove those genes that are not important in defining whether you have a heavy burden of your disease, and instead of a relatively well-controlled one. But that's then it is coming back to this.
That's I feel that that's another strong assumption that you would be making. I'm only interested in genes whose expression is somehow correlated with a number of exacerbations or something like that.
Yes. But there's always an assumption that you have to make. There's always a question that you have to define at the beginning of your analysis. It could be that you say, I'm interested in the whole genome, whole proteome, accepting that you are probably bringing a lot of noise or bringing a lot of useless dimensions in your analysis that are maybe going to be filtered down the line, but you don't know really. Or it could be that you have a really deep clinical question already at the beginning, and you say, I'm interested as a pharma company, say, in developing a drug that addresses patients that have X and Y profiles. Then I'm filtering according to that and seeing down the line what is happening. You could also see, as a doctor, I'm interested in better treating patients that are not responding to drug. So you would have, in the population of patients, you would take those that are taking a drug, and then those that still have very high symptoms, very heavy burden of the disease, compare them with those that are well controlled. And then you see what is different between those, and then you can make hypotheses down the line. So that, yeah, it's never ideal, and you have to really formulate precisely what is the question that you are asking for, and what is the data you should use to really tackle that question. This is a very important message. The question you ask conditions all your analysis downstream, and you really have to think hard and deep about that question before you do anything.
It did feel to me that you're getting away without that, in a way, in your case, but you just made the assumption about global similarity being the very, let's say, the most interesting thing to look at.
Well, it's the first thing to look at. There's many different ways, other ways to cut a tree.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, it makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
May I pick on that? So you use similarity network fusion, and you mentioned yourself in the talk that there are many ways to do clustering, and it's really hard, and you tried so many things. So maybe along the entire process, you considered a consensus clustering of different clustering techniques, or why not, or yeah.
So we actually did in this case, it's similarity network fusion compile and then consensus clustering. So you generate a fused similarity network that you then feed into the consensus clustering. In this case, we use the spectral clustering, which is recommended by the authors of similarity network fusion. But we also tried, I can't remember now because we did this a few months ago, the last time, but I think it's 5 or 6 other distances and not distances, algorithm for clusters. And actually, the results are very similar when you compile, when you use a distance between cluster to compare the results of the cluster rings after the case. You do see that the results of spectral clustering agree with most of the other techniques. Whether it's a case that it so happens in our data or whether it's a mathematical reason behind, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Then I thank you very much, Bertrand, for the interesting talk.
Thank you.
And this means that we have come to the end of our training school.